And moving on now, as Japan prepares to host the TICAD Summit in Yokohama later this year, there is a fresh push to transform development diplomacy into commercially meaningful partnerships. Bernard Laurendeau, Fintech founder and CEO of Tokyo-based Enkopa Lab, argues that Africa is no longer just a frontier for aid, but a dynamic on-the-tapped market ready for serious tech-driven investment. With decades of Japanese support for infrastructure and healthcare, the next leap could be digital, and fintech may be the missing link in reaching the last mile of financial inclusion. But first, Japanese firms need better data, stronger local partnerships, and a clear understanding of Africa's rapidly evolving consumer landscape. Bernard Laurendeau, managing partner, L&A, joins me for more on this. Thank you, Bernard, for joining me today.
Thanks for having me today.
All right, before we get into the main conversation, I just want to open with this. I mean, we're seeing a pullback from the United States towards Africa, whether it is in terms of aid or trade. Do you think that's concerning or just an opportunity for other players?
Well, I think let me rephrase that a little bit, right? I think it's a repackaging and resetting of the relationships. I think the president of South Africa was there yesterday, and they had a pretty fruitful conversation, right? So I think what we're going to see coming from the US in the next few months will just be a stronger interest, I believe, of the African continent, but more focused on trades and investment rather than aid.
I'm tempted to go with you on this because you're talking about fruitful. I mean, what was fruitful about that conversation yesterday? I mean, there was really, I'm not sure there was any agreement on trade. It was more about white farmers, Afrikaners, genocide. I mean, that was what the conversation was more about. And some persons have even called it an ambush for the South African president.
Sure. I mean, look, if you follow the legacy media only, I think that's definitely the messaging that came out from that encounter. But if you really follow the whole encounter between these two leaders and also their delegations, I think there was a pretty good exchange of thoughts and information. And this is important for the African continent at large, because as we all know, South Africa is one of the leading economies on the continent. And let's be real with ourselves, right? I think for a lot of the Western economies, the African economy as a whole, and I know there's 54 countries, but remains somewhat of a small trading partner, right? So they haven't really been exposed to what's really going on the continent. So I think the fact that the South African leader is giving this new administration a flavor of what's happening and the exciting opportunities is really good news for all of us on the continent.
Well, that's quite interesting. It remains to be seen how Africa is going to key into this new trade model that the United States is proposing, talking more about reciprocity and ensuring that, both parties benefit at the end of the day. But there are also talks about, some countries filling this space. Do you think Japan stands a chance, whether it is trade, investment, or aid, or maybe not aid?
Yeah. And look, I think it's up to, we shouldn't paint ourselves, African leaders, decision makers, ministers, government officials and whatnot as somewhat of spectators, right, of the geopolitics and of what's going on in the whole world. We should be active leaders and really lead those conversations. So I think it's up to the African leaders, again, on the government side, but as well on the private sector side, to really pick and choose. I think 30 years ago, when you were to go in the lobby of an African decision maker, whether it be in the West, East, South, you name it, they would have been either a British or a French. I'm half French myself. But nowadays, those relationships, thankfully for all of us, have been diversified. What you'll find in that lobby now is either a Turkish representative, Chinese, the UAE, and Japan, right? And it's up to us to pick and choose. I believe that now a lot of the African nations are at that point where they really have their, things that they want to put forward, and they have some leverage, right? I think this is a key word that's coming up in 2025, and we need to increase that leverage. All of us on the African nations, on the African continent, we have things to offer. We just need to put those things forward very clearly. We need to provide the data. We need to provide that expertise, and I think we shouldn't feel like we're not equal at the table. And I think that's what the U.S. is really giving us as an opportunity, is to be treated as equals.
I feel Africa does have the leverage. We have the bargaining chip and all of that. But why does it seem like that is not happening? Why is Africa looking like the one who goes, cap in hand, looking for aid and all of those things? I mean, there are so many resources that can't be deepened. What is the challenge? What is the problem? I mean, what stops Africa from developing itself?
Well, I mean, we could take the next 36 hours to debate about this. But in a nutshell, I think, first of all, what we need to look at is who are the shareholders of the largest investment funds, the largest institutions, and so on and so forth on the African continent. And the sad answer is that when you look at even institutions like the AFDB today, the US, Japan, France, and others in the West are still large shareholders of the AFDB. I think very recently the African Union, NEPAD, launched a African focused fund, and that is very good news, right? The fact that the Trump administration is removing 500 million from the African Development Bank is a very good wake-up call for all of us on the African continent. Why is it that in the 21st century, the African Development Bank, the leading bank on the African continent, right, and the most active, and we have to give them credit for all of the amazing work that they've been doing. Why is it that their largest shareholders are still non-African nations? So of course, when at the table you still have foreign interests, of course, the direction in which this fund or institution is going to go towards is going to be directed by those people who are at the table. So it's up to us Africans to finally, once and for all, say we need to lead, beyond the speeches, beyond those different words that we put out there. We need to really take action and start owning these funds, start really owning these institutions and leading.
That's quite interesting. But now let's take a look at, trade between Japan and Africa for a bit, looking specifically at trade and investment. What's your overview of it?
Yeah, so one of the good things, right, about Japan and the US is that they don't have that historical baggage that maybe a France or a UK, a Portugal would have, or even the Germans, right? So Japan and the US, but let's focus on Japan for a second, has a very clean historical record. There's no such thing as colonization in the past or nothing of that nature. What Japan brings to the table is, in some cases, more than 100 years of bilateral relationships, but on the African continent level, almost 30 years or beyond of a consistent relationship. When you look at and use TICAD, so the Tokyo International, I believe I forgot the full acronym, but basically it's the African leaders and the Japanese leaders coming together every 3 years. So when you look at that convention, that conference, it's been happening consistently for the last 30 years, right? So I think that's number one. Japan brings consistency. It brings also not quantity of investment, but rather quality. And what we need at this juncture on the African continent, maybe not for all countries, but I think a lot of the countries on the African continent are at that juncture where, the middle class is growing, and now we're stepping into, kind of a middle income stage, right? Is we really need an injection of know-how, of technology transfer, and so on and so forth, right? And I think the ones that are the best placed to really provide that kind of technology and knowledge transfer are the Japanese. I mean, first of all, we have a pretty good relationship that is pretty neutral from a historical standpoint, I think, for most of the African countries. And number two, we really respect and admire their product, right? Whether it be historically, traditionally for the automobile industry, for infrastructure and logistics. But now is the time in 2025 to really increase that amount of trade and bring in some new types of areas, some verticals that are going to be really important for, again, these the middle income economies that are growing, right? And maybe just to name a few, right? What gets us excited at Enkopa Lab is really the fast-moving consumer goods, and there's a lot of work on the African continent that needs to be done and ahead of us. The whole sector of the financial services, right? Whether it be banking, insurance, or fintech, right? And then finally tech, right? Because nowadays, what gets really out there in the news is the fact that we have rare earth minerals. What we believe actually at Enkopa Lab, and Enkopa in the Giz language, the ancient Ethiopian language, it actually means gold ore or pure gold. And that pure gold is actually what we have in our brains. It's not under our feet. It's actually above our feet. It's in our brains. It's in the youth that we have. And look, Japan as a pyramid, actually an inverse pyramid that is pretty flat at the top. In terms of its demographics, when you look at most of the African countries, it's the complete opposite, right? So it's a good match because Japan really needs new areas of expansion in the next 20 years. It's actually very scary what's happening here is, the population is decreasing really, really rapidly. 2024, the latest numbers that we see from the Japanese population is that it continues to shrink. And so, they need to find new areas of growth. And Africa has that. Again, not all African countries, but a few of them.
Not all African countries, but a few of them. We'll come to that later. But you said something about the volume of trade. Now, let me say this. Japan's total trade with Africa in 2021 is estimated at 1 trillion Japanese yuan. That was in exports. And of course, it was 1.5 trillion in imports. From the African perspective, the figure doesn't look so good. Why is that? And what can be done to sort of, balance that and probably make it better? Because, we're talking the whole of Africa.
Right. And look, I think to be transparent, ChatGPT usually doesn't give you on the African continent the best answer, right? So of course, if you ask ChatGPT or Google for that matter, in terms of what's really happening on the African continent from a Japanese standpoint, the numbers don't look good. Our partner, Kasi Insight, that's based out of Kenya, has, we believe, the most accurate figure, and we believe the figures are a little bit above that actually. But what we're really focused on, to be honest, is again not the size of those investments, and rather the quality, right? And we believe that the partnerships currently that are active from a Japan-Africa standpoint on the African continent are ones of really optimal quality. And so we just need to multiply those, right? And there's also some greenfield areas. Like, for instance, tech, when you look at sexy and very interesting areas such as AI, right? We believe that, again, the African continent has the youth, has that really skillful and skilled youthful population that nowhere else on earth actually you can find at that level of quantity, right? And those are the cards that the African leaders need to put on the table. It's not just, again, the rare earth minerals and everything, but it's really that middle class economy, middle class size that's growing, and also the brains that we have on the African continent.
All right, so talking about this, how then do we begin to, deepen all of this? That's the path you've chosen, which is whether it's financial services, tech, AI, and all.
Yeah, so what we're focused on at Enkopa Lab is really, and the reason why we decided to actually plant our flag here in Tokyo is because, look, when you're a Japanese investor, you actually don't really know where to go. The minute you decide that, hey, maybe I want to expand to Africa rather than India, the knee-jerk reaction is to go to the JETRO organization, which has been doing a lot of good work, right, for the last few decades. But they just have their limitations, right? This is a government entity that's subsidized, right? And the expertise that they have on each and every single country, the relationships that they have are somewhat limited. And of course, the data, right? So when you look at, I attended very recently a symposium here of Japan, India, Africa, and the data that was presented about Africa was mostly coming from the World Bank and the IMF. What we're providing is much more disaggregated data, consumer level data, that really investors can use to simulate and experiment if their expansion to a specific country actually makes sense. And it may be that the answer is no, right? And so what we need is to bring confidence to that Japanese investor or elsewhere, right? But we need to give them that confidence by providing the expertise that they need at the time when they need it, and also the specific amount of data that they need at the quality level and disaggregation level that they need.
All right, Bernard, we'll take a break now, and when we come back, we'll just wrap up this conversation, especially looking specifically at TICAD. Thank you. Stay with us. Glad to know you're still with us, and we're still talking about the relationship between Japan and Africa, how we can deepen trade, and especially fintech. And of course, before we went on that timeout, my guest, Bernard, did a great job trying to tell us, all that we have available in that regard. Thank you so much, Bernard, for staying with me.
Thanks for having me.
All right, I'm not sure what you meant the other time when I was asking you about the trade volume between, Japan and Africa, but I just wanted to point out that that data is actually from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, which gives us the 2021 figure of the trade between Japan and Africa. But away from that, TICAD, which is Tokyo International Conference on African Development, is co-hosted by United Nations Development Program, which is UNDP, World Bank, African Union Commission, and of course, the governments of Japan. So what should we expect from it this year? Are you hopeful, of anything substantially different, or what sort of cases should we be making?
Sure. So look, I think the last TICAD happened, I believe it was in Cairo, but it really happened in the middle of the COVID crisis, right? So I think a lot of the investment commitments that were made at the time, some of them came to fruition, some of them didn't. But the whole world was going through somewhat of a turmoil, right? And then of course, and there was also the government was a bit unstable, and here we are 3 years later, and we have a new prime minister here in Japan that's been who's been doing his best at really multiplying the different bilateral relationships around the world. And we see a greater interest from Japan to Africa. I mean, we just see it by the sheer amount of, conferences. I was recently at a very tech-oriented event here in Tokyo, the largest actually in Southeast Asia and Japan and South Korea. And look, they had discussions around Africa, right? And of course, those discussions still stay at the Africa level. And what we've been trying to tell them is that Africa is not a monolith continent where you have just one type of population, one type of economy. There's many different countries, right? And so, for instance, if you're an AC unit provider, right, you need to think of maybe some countries maybe in the West Coast, but maybe not some in the high plateaus like Addis Ababa, right? Because we usually don't really need AC units. But the point is that we expect a stronger interest, first of all, from Japan to Africa. And then even from the African side, we believe that there's going to be a much greater presence from the African leaders, accompanied by business delegations, right? So, I mean, we'll see what happens between August 20th and 22nd, but we've been told that there's going to be more business delegations. And there are going to be also a lot of sideline conversations that are business oriented, rather than pure political conversations, and centered around security, peace, and those kinds of things.
All right, thank you so much, Bernard Laurendeau, Managing Partner L&A and founder Enkopa Lab, for your time and your thoughts on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
Definitely.